Hi, afternoon, everybody. We'll be starting in just a couple minutes. Just going to give it everybody some time to get in. Thank you again to our participants and our presenters. My name is Giselle Dean. I am the organizer of the Bahamas Natural History Conference. I work as a science officer at the Bahamas National Trust. So just a few more minutes before we start. Hi, Dr. Smith.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm well. I was just trying to get in contact with you to see if I can get the slides up for the presentation.
Sure, we can, let's do that now. You should be able to share your screen now.
Okay, let me see. Give me a second. Can you see my presentation?
Yep, I can see the opening slide, looks like.
Yeah, and it's moving. You can see everything?
Yep,
okay,
everything looks fine.
Great. So I'll just leave it like that. So when it's my turn, I just have to basically you'll share the screen and I'll just start?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool.
Okay. All right.
Can I just confirm what's the talk time?
15 minutes, we are saying, but if you go a little bit over, that should be okay.
No, that sounds good. That'll be plenty.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think we're gonna be starting soon, so I'm gonna mute myself.
Good afternoon to all that has joined us thus far for our 6th session of Bahamas Natural History Conference Virtual. We are under the theme 2020 and Beyond, the fishing industry's future. And today we will start with our first speaker, Dr. Nick Hicks from the Cape Eleuthera Institute. And just for everyone that's joining us, my name is Pachancia Knowles, and I am the Marine Science Officer at the Bahamas National Trust.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll just begin sharing my screen here. Okay, hopefully, can you all see my presentation?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, thank you all. It's a privilege and an honor to be presenting here. This is my first BNHC conference. I'm actually ashamed to say that. I would have loved to have been presenting in previous years, but very glad to be here today. Speaking on something that's actually a little bit outside of my normal area of work. In fact, I'm glad we have some of these other panelists here today who are probably more experienced in speaking in this area. I actually mainly work on lobster fisheries, but we are living in uncertain times right now and wanted to present some work that I've just been doing over the last couple of weeks. Now, before I get into that, as I say, really, I've been involved in lobster fisheries my whole life. I come from Spanish Wells. We call ourselves the lobster fishing capital of the Bahamas. But scientifically speaking, I got involved with lobster fisheries really at a fundamental level, looking at some cool stuff that's going on at the base of the food chain, where it turns out the lobsters get a big part of their food from these particular clams that get their food from a form of primary productivity called chemosynthesis. So this is different from photosynthesis and was a very cool insight, a very little known process that actually seems to be really important for the lobster fishery here in the Bahamas. And that was published in 2016, freely available there. And another interesting outcome of that work was that it showed really tight links between seagrass ecosystems and the lobster fishery here in the Bahamas. And I'd be glad to talk to anybody more about that in detail. And then from there, I continued involvement from a science perspective when I got involved with the Fisheries Improvement Project, looking at the sustainability of spiny lobsters, and wrote a couple of reports as a consultant for that project on the potential ecosystem impacts of the fishery, the use of artificial shelters, and also interactions with protected species. And those two reports are there and freely available. And really, I was left with more questions than answers. And some of those questions are the kind of things that Lester was talking about in a previous session, Dr. Gittins. And some of the questions I'm still trying to answer today, and that's what I've been doing the last 2 years here at the Cape Eleuthera Institute, trying to answer some of these questions. And that's what I planned to present on today, back when we were all planning to be meeting in person in Nassau. However, events in the wider world overtook all of us, and that research actually was put on hold because of the coronavirus, which has impacted everywhere, including here in the Bahamas. And the work I'm going to talk to you about today really came about because of the situation we found ourselves in with the coronavirus pandemic. So I was going to start by running through a little timeline here. Starting on the 13th of March, the first confirmed case of COVID-19 in the Bahamas, running all the way till the 8th of June when we resumed domestic travel. Now, shortly after that first case, very shortly actually, the cruise ship terminals here in South Eleuthera closed. So we have 2 cruise ship terminals, Princess Keys and Half Moon Key. And that eventually led to the layoff of over 200 people. So immediately you had some of the largest employers in our part of the Bahamas closing down, which had a big impact locally. Of course, by the 19th and 23rd of March, we had the introduction of emergency orders and a 24-hour curfew. And interestingly, only 2 days later, the government realized how important subsistence fishing was and would be during this time and exempted that from the weekday curfew. So from as early as the 25th of March, the government exempted subsistence fishing during daylight hours. It was one of the few things that people were allowed out of their properties for. And what we started to notice, at least here, because you know, we still travel that much, what we started to see were lots of people out subsistence fishing, you know, going out getting food. Here you can see 4 people wading out collecting conch. And while this has always happened to some extent around here, what we noticed, at least qualitatively, was a big increase in the frequency of people out subsistence fishing. And sometimes there'd be up to 10 people walking out, you know, less than a quarter of a mile from the beach, subsistence fishing. So a real increase in the activity there. And then on my daily exercise, you know, that was restricted to our locality, you'd come across piles of conch shells that were being left behind from the fishers. Here's a little close up here. And so as I began to see this more and more, I realized that something important was happening here, that we were seeing an effect of the coronavirus pandemic on the local fisheries and changes to the fisheries, and really felt that needed to be documented, because it's one thing to say, yes, more people subsistence fishing, but what does that look like? What does that mean? And so I really decided to just start documenting this for posterity more than anything else. And so by the time we got to the Easter holiday lockdown, I decided to collect all of the conch shells that had been deposited on the shore near the Cape Eleuthera Institute, and take them back to Cape Eleuthera Institute for measurement. So I cleared the shoreline of all the recently deposited conch shells, and thereafter every week continued to collect shells that had been newly deposited, which provided a week by week snapshot of the fishing that had been happening. And of course, there were things happening in the wider world. So by the 19th of April, we actually had construction business resume on Eleuthera. By 4th of May, curbside business was allowed to resume. And by 2nd of June, you had full commercial activities resume. And then by 8th of June, domestic travel resumed. So over this time period, the emergency orders and coronavirus in the Bahamas was evolving. Now, just to give you a little bit of local context about what I'm talking about here, this is Cape Eleuthera, the very southwest tip of Eleuthera. We at CEI are based just here where this yellow star is. And the fishery that I'm talking about really happens in this ringed off area. It's pretty much fishers that are wading out from the shore and catching conch that they can find in wading depth water. There are many other artisanal fishers that are based out of the Cape as well, and they fish over a much wider area here around Rock Sound and the Schooner Keys. And they go out by boat. But what I'm talking about is exclusively fishing happening from the shore by people walking in. And really, this site is accessible in 3 locations: at a public beach here, and then where the road actually runs along the shore, people can drive up and have immediate access to that shore and the fishery. And actually, this fishery has been existing for a very long time. If you look at the beach and the shoreline and what it looks like, the kind of area I'm talking about, it's a sandy, rocky shore, and all of the dark patch you can see in the picture on the top right, that isn't sand, that's all conch shell. So there's been a very long history of a conch fishery based off of this shoreline. And then these piles of conch shells, some of which are quite old, that we would call conch middens, but including recent as well as old shell deposits there. And this fishery has been studied before, in fact, by my predecessor, Andy Danilchuk and Sasha Clark, in what was the very first scientific publication produced by the Cape Eleuthera Institute back in 2005. So really going back to the root, our roots here, revisiting this fishery. And actually that provides an interesting baseline that I'll talk about a little bit later. So that's kind of the scene of what I'm talking about. And just for context, between Cape Eleuthera Institute and this creek here, the shoreline is about almost a mile long. So it's about a mile long of shoreline. And really, while there are places where people tend to fish from and deposit the conch, the shells really are left behind all along the shoreline. And so at the end of every week, I'd go along and collect all the shells for measurements, and taking morphometric measurements on the length, width, lip thickness, all really the standard measurements that anybody looking at a conch fishery would take. So just to be clear what I'm talking about with subsistence fisheries, this is really talking about seafood that's caught for consumption by yourself, your family, or your friends. Some people would even extend that to seafood that's caught for consumption locally, and that doesn't really enter the main seafood markets. And really the next level of small scale fishery up from that is the artisanal fisheries that also exist in this area. And that's more people who are fishing for a living, to make money. What I'm talking about is people who are just going out to get food. Now, typically subsistence fisheries are very poorly documented and undervalued. Most countries don't even report subsistence fishing or catch rates for subsistence fishing, because it's so hard to get reliable data. And you know, that's something that I was very aware of when I started this, was like, hey, we just really don't have that much good data. Actually, one of the best attempts at evaluating this was by Dr. Smith, who's going to be speaking today. So I'm going to be leaning on her to answer a lot of questions, hopefully. But you know, in their paper, they came up with an estimate of about 590 tons of seafood annually caught by subsistence fishers in the Bahamas. And that works out to about 16 to 33 kilograms per person per year, depending on where you live. And, oh, I apologize, Dr. Smith. I think the full citation was supposed to be on there, but I'm sure we can get access to that work. So that's a little bit of background on subsistence fisheries. So what did we see? What were we seeing during this period? This graph just shows, start off basic with the number of shells collected every week along that 1 mile of shoreline. So week 1, about 200 conch. And really, I don't have any good data on the actual number of people out fishing, but we never really saw ever more than 10 people out at a time, and usually it was more like 3 to 5. So you got 200 conch, and that gradually increased over the 3-week period after Easter, up to almost 300 conch in 1 week caught. And then there was a sharp decline and a drop off. And actually, I've collected conchs up to 12 weeks afterwards when I stopped, and it never really increased again after more than 50. So that's one thing I should mention, is that, of course, this is an ongoing study. That's one of the beauty of conferences, is just being able to present up to date information, and these analyses aren't quite finished, so this is really just a first pass over the data. Now, because we're talking about subsistence fisheries, if we convert that catch to actual how much conch meat was harvested, you're looking at between 10 15 kilograms per week in those first 3 weeks. The numbers above the orange dots here represent the number of meals that, like typical meal portion sizes, that conch would have provided. So again, the same pattern. Now what you see is a slight change because the size of the conchs slightly changed, and I want to just talk about that quickly here. So this, I guess, ring diagram represents proportions of conch. So we had nearly 900 conch caught in those first few weeks. Of those, 11% were of legal size. That means 11% had flared lips. Of that, only 8% had lips that were thicker than 4 millimeters. So the vast majority of these conchs were illegal sized, were definitely juveniles. 33% were actually in the smallest size category, less than 150 centimeters. What does that look like? Here are some of the conchs. So the scale bar on the right is 15 centimeters. So 1/3 of the conchs caught over this time period were less than 15 centimeters long in total length. Another 55% were between 15 and 20 centimeters long. And the reason is that this area out here is a known conch nursery. But how does that compare? As I said, there's been a long-term historical fishery here. If we go back to the data that was collected by my predecessors, back in 2003, actually almost 40% of the catch was of legal size back then. So we've seen a 70% reduction in the proportion of the catch that's legal sized. Still a lot of juveniles back in 2003, but even then, those juveniles were a lot bigger. So you had a lot larger proportion in that 50 to 20 centimeter size range and fewer in that less than 15 centimeter size range. So really still an increasing number and an increased number of juvenile conchs being harvested here. Now these are size frequency diagrams for each week, for the conch caught in each week. Now this top one is conch shells that were collected before we started the weekly collections. And I've only got around to analyzing a small proportion of that. So this isn't, the top one is not quantitative, but it does give you an idea. And this is the median size. So the size at which half of the conch are bigger and half of the conch are smaller. So from the shells that we've measured so far, that was about 165 millimeters, sorry, 16.5 centimeters. Now, in week one, we saw a dramatic decrease in the median size, so lots more smalls being caught. Week two, this median size went up a little bit. By week three, when actually we had the largest number of conch being caught, there was a huge decrease in the median size down to just over 14 centimeters, which was pretty small. So for reference, just, you know, so you can picture it in your head, the average size length of conch where we started to see a flared lip was about 180 centimeters. So even by week four, sorry, where there was quite a huge drop off in the number of conch being caught, still only a slight increase in the size there. So what can we take away from this? And sorry, I'm going over time here, so I'll be quick. What I think we're seeing was a decline in the conch size being caught over time. And this may be because the big ones were taken early and we're just seeing a kind of fishing down the size spectrum. We also saw a sharp decline in landings that coincided with the resumption of curbside business. So what I think was happening was once business started to resume, we saw less of a reliance on this fishery for food. And what was interesting is that we actually could see more fine scale differences in the fishing. So there were piles of shells where clearly some people were only targeting large shells, and some piles where people were taking whatever they could get. So we can discern those kind of individual level variations. And I think one of the worries that comes out of this for me is the potential for practices that happen in extreme times, such as we're in now, to become normalized. And this idea potentially of even shifting baselines over time, that what is okay in desperate times becomes the norm. Now, there's a really, it was an interesting paper published in 2019, referenced down there, of looking at the idea of fisheries as a natural insurance in the, and this study was done in Andros, where they realized that fisheries provide a valuable safety net, not just in times like coronavirus, but particularly after hurricanes, that when times are tough, people in the Bahamas turn to the sea for food. And really, I think we in the Bahamas need to value that more. And the question is, you know, how much do we value that insurance? that we have. Because I could tell you things, especially in South Eleuthera where I am now, would be a lot worse if people did not have this food source to turn to. Another interesting outcome of this is to point out that the coronavirus impacts might not be obvious at first, especially on the ecosystem. There's a lot of talk right now about the benefits to nature that the pandemic has had, reduced human activities, but there have certainly been some impacts. This is one of them, and we need to recognize that these might not always be obvious and direct, and we probably see the same thing after hurricanes. And I think it's important to say right now, like this, I really don't think this is something that's peculiar to here. I think this is happening across the Bahamas, and one of the reasons I wanted to study it is because we need to be aware and cognizant of what's happening in the real world, probably across the Bahamas right now as this pandemic has taken hold. And the big million-dollar questions are, what are the long-term effects of this? And really, will we as a country be able to count on subsistence fishing and easy access to fisheries for people in the future? As we face more challenges, potentially more hurricanes, we need to really value this resource and the role that subsistence fishing plays, because I've seen firsthand just how important it's been. Sorry that took so long. Thank you very much. And I'll just leave you with this question that I've had to wrestle with. And this is the question we ask ourselves all the time here at the Cape Eleuthera Institute. How do we live well in this place? And this is a question that we're still trying to answer. And I think, as you can see from the presentation today, it is not an easy one to answer, but I hope we could have a fruitful discussion at the end. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Higgs, for sharing your data and findings on the importance of subsistence fisheries as a safety net during the coronavirus pandemic, a case study from the Queen Conch fishery. If you have any questions from our attendees, if you have any questions for Dr. Higgs or the other panelists, please submit them in the chat below, the question and answer chats, and we will be sure to answer those questions, hand them over to the panelists at the end of the session. I will invite Dr. Kalisa Colwood to share her screen as she discuss and share on examining the development of a parrotfish fishery, social considerations and management implications.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I lost my Zoom screen and couldn't figure out how to unmute myself. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Kalisa Colwood, and I'm currently with the Perry Institute of Marine Science. And today I'll be talking about the emerging parrotfish fishery in the Bahamas and the work that we've been doing to understand the social drivers leading to the creation of the fishery. So why do we care about parrotfish? Simply, they are critical for maintaining healthy coral reefs. As key algal grazers, parrotfish help to prevent the overgrowth of algae on reefs. And in 2014, the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network released a status report that indicated the healthiest reefs in the Caribbean are those with large parrotfish populations, while reefs where parrotfish had been overfished have suffered tragic declines. The report concluded that overfishing of this species can have a significant impact on reef health, and protecting grazers like parrotfish can help to restore coral reefs. Although parrotfish have traditionally not been a popular species targeted by Bahamian fishers, a fishery for the species has emerged over the past few years. Parrotfish can sometimes be seen in local fish markets. Despite this, when you examine the most recent FAO capture data for the country, parrotfish does not appear in its own category and is most likely being captured in the other category for all the other things being fish that are not major categories. So there's a limited data available to help quantify what is actually being harvested. Overall, there's currently not enough information to understand what is occurring in the fishery, how fast it's growing, how choices are being made, how to manage it appropriately. This project, which continues on earlier work, seeks to gain a better understanding of those social drivers by examining the development of this new fishery in the Bahamas, looking at changes in the fishery and in fisher behavior, and understanding motivations for how choices within the fishery are being made. Few parrotfish studies have incorporated social science methods, and to my knowledge, none to date have incorporated fishers' perceptions and motivations to understand the human drivers impacting the ecological system. Overall, it's the hope that this research will provide relevant information that can ultimately be linked with ecological data to provide holistic recommendations for management and policy. So for this project, we surveyed commercial, recreational, and subsistence fishers with the help of volunteers from partner organizations during 2017 and 2018. These surveys collected information on demographics and socioeconomics, fishers' harvesting characteristics, seafood consumption and sale, and fishers' knowledge and perceptions. Responses were evaluated based on key demographic factors, and these response variables were compared using a chi-squared test for independence to determine statistical significance. So looking at demographics first, data was collected from 164 fishers from 12 islands throughout the Bahamas. We surveyed fishers in every age group, with more than 60% of them between the ages of 35 and 64. 43% of respondents are living in households where less than 60% of their family contributes to the income, and 50% of the fishers indicated that less than 60% of their income comes from fishing. For more than 50% of these respondents, fishing is their full-time occupation. Yet, 74% of them report needing to have multiple jobs in order to support their families. Additionally, more than half of the fishers identified themselves as commercial fishers, with 30% of them doing some combination of commercial, subsistence, and recreational fishing. Moving on to harvesting, consumption, and sale. When asked to identify the top 5 species they fish for, there was no surprise that respondents mainly identified snapper, grouper, and lobster. However, only about 1% of the 720 responses on this question ID'd parrotfish as one of their main targets. These fishers were from Eleuthera, New Providence, Mayaguana, Andros, and Abaco. Yet, when asked about parrotfish specifically, 64% of the same fishers admitted to harvesting the species. Fishers statistically most likely to harvest parrotfish are between the ages of 25 to 54. They are full-time fishers, and they tend to be from Eleuthera, New Providence, and Grand Bahama. Just over 50% of these fishers report that they began harvesting this species more than 15 years ago. While there were a variety of reasons for choosing to harvest parrotfish, the top 3 that emerged were because of taste, because the fisher takes anything that they catch, or because parrotfish was specifically requested by someone. Hawaiian slings and hand lines are the gear types most often used to harvest parrotfish. And this was statistically significant between islands. It's also important to note that fishers from every island, with the exception of Grand Bahama and San Salvador, harvest parrotfish with a spear or Hawaiian sling, increasing the likelihood that they won't be able to release those individuals safely. 46% of fishers report rarely harvesting parrotfish during their trips, while 28% of them harvest every time they go out. Fishers from Eleuthera and New Providence are more likely to claim they rarely harvest parrotfish, while those who make more than 90% of their income from fishing are most likely to admit to fish for them every day. Fishers who acknowledge collecting parrotfish identified at least 9 species that they typically collect. They also indicated that each trip they harvest an average of 6 individuals, ranging in average size from 8 to 30 inches. Fishers from New Providence and Mayaguana are the only ones to report catching all 9 species. Blue, rainbow, and stoplight parrotfish are the most commonly harvested species among this group. And the 2020 Bahamas Coral Reef Report, which is being released sometime this week, identified stoplight parrotfish as one of the most important grazers for corals in the Bahamas. Respondents who harvest parrotfish primarily sell or eat what they catch. Fishers from every island surveyed eat parrotfish, and similarly, fishers from every island, with the exception of those from Spanish Wells and San Salvador, report selling it. Fishers were also asked the 3 main types of seafood eaten in their household. Only 2 of these fishers listed parrotfish, though when asked about parrotfish directly, 43% responded that they and their families consume parrotfish. Fishers have described it as a sweet-tasting fish, or they say it tastes a lot like grouper. Seasonal fishers, however, are more likely to not eat it. Although consumption by island was not found to be statistically significant, there are some interesting distinctions that emerge, with the highest consumption rates occurring on Mayaguana, New Providence, and Andros. And if you remember from a few slides ago, Mayaguana and New Providence were also the islands where the highest number of different species were being harvested. Fishers sell parrotfish primarily to individuals, particularly immigrants from Jamaica and Haiti on some islands. And while there was not a lot of data collected on price, what we did collect demonstrates the inconsistencies in how the product is sold. Some fishers sell it by the pound, while others sell by the individual fish, and there's a wide range of prices as seen here. Some of these higher prices may be due to fishers being able to sell parrotfish as grouper. Moving on to attitudes, knowledge, and perceptions. Almost 70% of fishers believe they understand the role of parrotfish in the environment. These responses were coded to determine how accurate their understanding was. Less than 10% of fishers demonstrated a complete understanding of parrotfish ecosystem functions by being able to describe that parrotfish eat algae, and in doing so, help corals. Most of the fishers, however, have a basic knowledge of this role. Almost 50% of the fishers believe that fishing is the largest threat to parrotfish populations, but 20% believe there are no threats. Also, only 43% of fishers believe harvesting parrotfish actually impacts parrotfish populations. Those who say no believe that hardly anyone is harvesting parrotfish, or that there are so many parrotfish in the oceans that harvesting them wouldn't put a dent in their numbers. This differs significantly by island, with fishers from Mayaguana and New Providence again most likely to believe there are no impacts. Yet, 76% agree that the harvest of parrotfish can impact coral reefs. And this perception differs significantly by age and the amount of income earned from fishing. 89% of respondents believe that fisheries resources should be managed, yet 70% of them think these resources are currently managed poorly, citing limited and inconsistent enforcement as a big issue. 87% of fishers believe that they can be successful working in collaboration with conservation organizations in order to protect these resources. Those who say no feel that many organizations come in with a very westernized approach where they have all the answers and fishers have nothing of value to contribute, or where the strategies that are being proposed are at odds with the wants and/or needs of the fishers. More than 60% of fishers say that they have been involved in protecting marine resources, and that involvement has included things like following established restrictions, participating in fisheries meetings, working in some capacity with researchers. Of those who said no, 65% are interested in getting involved in some way. And while full-time fishers are statistically more likely to not be involved currently in protection, they are also more likely to want to get involved. 76% of the fishers think marine and coastal areas should be protected, and 81% are willing to designate these areas as no-take zones. These fishers want to see more protected areas or bans on fishing, particularly around creeks and mangroves that serve as nurseries for important fish species. Areas often cited as potential no-take areas include Hog Key Bank, the Jumentos, Key Lobos, Chub Key, and the Berry Islands. So moving on to key findings. First, parrotfish is harvested by a variety of groups in the Bahamas. Statistically, full-time fishers, those between the ages of 25 to 64, and fishers from New Providence, Grand Bahama, and Eleuthera are most likely to harvest the species. In particular, the full-time fishers and the age group of 25 to 64 makes up a large enough percent of this study to be concerned about the quantity harvested. Second, parrotfish is also harvested for a variety of reasons. Some fishers collect because they will take anything they harvest, some because they are using it to feed their families, others because it's being requested, and some just because they like to eat it. Because no clear-cut reason has yet to emerge from the data, there's a need to further understand fisher motivations with regard to these species. Third, fishers have a limited understanding of the role of parrotfish in the environment. They misunderstand the relationship between parrotfish and corals, as well as the impacts that can be caused by decreasing parrotfish populations. Similarly, fishers don't see harvesting as a threat to parrotfish populations. While they recognize that humans and ultimately fishing are big threats to parrotfish, they don't believe a lot of people are fishing for parrotfish, even though more than 50% of those surveyed for this project are currently harvesting it. This research shows that conditions exist for a parrotfish market to develop, especially as requests lead to an increase in demand. While most fishers are currently keeping parrotfish for themselves, some are beginning to earn money by selling them to individuals and restaurants. Additionally, there's a wide price range that they get, mostly determined by what the fisher can get within their particular communities. If complete bans on harvesting parrotfish are determined to be the best option, which has been the management that has been done in several other Caribbean countries, policymakers here will need to think about how to shift that effort somewhere else, particularly for those fishers who are starting to make additional revenue. Next, management of the fishery may need to be location specific, as fishers from the various islands have different motivations for harvesting or eating parrotfish, different beliefs on how harvesting affects the ecosystem, including impacts to coral reefs, and different perspectives on how best to contribute to conservation efforts. Third, fishers' responses indicate that while they will support management strategies, they'll only do so with adequate enforcement. Fishers also recognize that any management efforts will fail without local cooperation and collaboration between all stakeholders. Additionally, fishers have indicated an interest in participating in conservation and management efforts, even if they aren't currently contributing to those efforts now. Fourth, statistical analysis shows that contributions to and sources of income has a heavy influence on the decisions made by these fishers. This includes their motivations for what they harvest, their decisions to follow rules and regulations when enforcement is lacking, and their interest in engaging in conservation actions and community participation. This again tells us that being able to shift effort in a way that will allow some of these fishers to recoup what they may suffer in light of a ban will be very important. And due to the limited understanding of parrotfish's ecological function, education and awareness are necessary to inform fishers of the importance of parrotfish to reef health and must be an important part of any management strategy that is implemented. So what's next? Hopefully, we'll be able to continue surveys and interviews in order to increase the number of responses. I also have some interest in potentially gathering more data in areas where major declines in parrotfish populations and our biomass have already been documented, such as the southern Bahamas and New Providence. This work has shown that in New Providence, fishers are statistically more likely to harvest for parrotfish while also claiming to rarely harvest them. And in both New Providence and Mayaguana, fishers are collecting a wide variety of parrotfish species, in addition to demonstrating a high consumption rate of parrotfish, while also being statistically more likely to believe that harvesting these species will not have any impact on the population. These examples highlight the need for a coupled socioeconomic and ecological research approach that can utilize some of the long-term data collected through protocols like AGRA. This will allow us to look at change over time within these ecosystems and examine how those areas with fishers most likely to harvest or consume parrotfish might contribute to declines in biomass, shifts in key species primarily responsible for grazing, changes in dominant phases or size class distributions of parrotfish. And this coupled approach will also help to determine further if social drivers that impact fishers' decisions and choices can influence or predict the magnitude of effects on reefs. Lastly, we need to look at how we can use this data to inform management strategies with a particular focus on promoting relevant conservation actions for fishers and consumers that will ultimately result in behavior changes within these local communities. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to questions in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Dr. Calwood, for sharing your studies on the parrotfish in the Bahamas, and hopefully we can get spread more awareness in protecting our marine resources, especially the parrotfish. Before we move on to our third speaker, I just want to get everyone's attention on the Bahamas, on the Natural History of the Bahamas book. The Natural History of the Bahamas book is a field guide that is small enough to carry on trips, yet is an ultra-comprehensive guide of terrestrial and coastal flora and fauna, including species and common names, locations, and detailed descriptions. The book was written by experts in Bahamian ecology with contributions by more than 30 other naturalists and researchers, and covers organisms studied in the Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos Islands with more than 700 color photos. It is available for sale in Providence at Logos Bookstore and Media Enterprises, as well as all natural park offices that the BNT manages throughout the Bahamas. The book can also be purchased online at Cornell University Press and on online book realtors, such as Amazon for Kindle instantly by mail. All royalties from book sales benefit the Bahamas National Trust, so it's a great way to support the Bahamas Natural History Conference. So on to our next speaker. We have Dr. Nicola Smith will now share a screen and provide her data and discussion on her topic.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, awesome. So good afternoon. Today I'm going to speak broadly about some of the research that I'm currently engaged in as a postdoctoral research fellow at Simon Fraser University. And this work is done in collaboration with Dr. Isabel Cote at Simon Fraser University and Dr. Daniel Pauly at the Sea Around Us at the University of British Columbia. Now, about reconstructing sponge fisheries in the Bahamas from its inception in the 1800s to present day, We aim to better understand both past and present day drivers and patterns in the fishery, as well as predict future patterns and the forces that might shape them. Now, I'd like to take a point. I'd like to point out at this point that I'm just going to give an overview of my research because it's still in its infancy, and I've had substantial setbacks due to COVID-19, as talked about by some of our other presenters today. One of them being I'm still stuck in Canada, so I can't get to the Bahamas to collect data. Now, starting with a brief overview of my talk, I'm going to begin with an overview of the sponge fishery, followed by study objectives, methods, and preliminary results. And then finally, I'll wrap up with the significance of this study. Now, before launching into the commercial importance of sponges, I was trained as an ecologist, and as such, I want to point out its ecological importance. Now, sponges serve as habitat and a source of food for a variety of fishes and invertebrates, while the method of obtaining food by drawing seawater through their pores acts as a form of water filtration and nutrient cycling in the ocean. Now, sponges were used for a variety of purposes in the past, including as municipal drinking water filters. And in World War I, sponges lined the helmets of soldiers, while in World War II, they were used to clean heavy machinery. Even further back in time, sponges lined the protective armor of Roman soldiers. And believe it or not, in the 19th century, women used sponges as a form of underground contraceptive, although I have absolutely no idea how that would work. Now, in present times, due to their highly absorbent skeletons, natural sponges of the genera Spongia and Hippospongia are primarily used as bath and cleaning products, as well as in pottery making and painting. However, there is a booming demand for other groups of sponges in the pharmaceuticals industry, whereas microbiome has been used in antibiotics, antifungal, and anti-cancer treatments. Likewise, the compounds found in sponges have been used as antifouling agents on ships and in agrochemicals to benefit crop production. So to the right of, you see this graph of the total number of compounds isolated from marine sponges from the top 10 source countries in the world over the last decade. Now, as you can see in yellow, the Bahamas is listed among the top 10 countries basically fueling the pharmaceuticals industry. Now, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on sponges that are harvested for the cosmetics and the ceramics industry, where there are over 1,000 genera of marine sponges, but only 2 of commercial importance, like I said before, and these are sponges from the genera Spongia and Hippospongia. Now, I've indicated the sponges that are found in the Bahamas with these red check marks, and you can see that 6 out of the 8 commercially valuable sponges in the region are actually found in the Bahamas. And I've circled the velvet sponge because this species is thought to have gone extinct in the late 1930s, early 1940s due to overfishing and disease, but we'll kind of come back to that point a bit later. Now, sponging began in the late 1800s when a Frenchman named Gustave Renaud, although I've seen other accounts that say this man in question, his name was actually Mr. Heyman, but I don't know which one is correct at this point. But anyway, Renaud or Heyman was shipwrecked in the Bahamas. And in 1841, Renaud exported the first sponges from the Bahamas to Paris. And as a result, he gave rise to what eventually became the leading industry in the Bahamas. So yes, before tourism, sponging was actually the leading industry for our country. Now in the Bahamas, sponges were harvested by what is known as the hooking method. And in short, this required like a large schooner that would carry 2 or more open boats with them, and there'd be 2 men per boat. One would be a sculler and the other one would be a hooker. And the sculler basically would pole the boat through the water to a point located by the hooker where there was a sponge. And as you can see in this picture, the hooker would have a wooden box, and on the bottom of the box would be a glass bottom so that they can find the sponges underwater. And then the hooker would basically take its hook, which is kind of like a rake-like looking thing, as you can see in the picture, and they would basically tear the sponge off of the bottom of the seafloor. And of course, this was a really destructive way of sponge fishing in the past because it didn't allow for regeneration. And that probably led to some of the overexploitation of the species in the past, but those methods have changed to be more sustainable, and we can talk more about that after this talk if there's time. Now, sponges are also processed in a pretty large, elaborate method, but I don't have time to talk about that today. But of course, like I said, if there's time afterwards, we can get into those details. Now, in 1901, at the height of the sponging industry in the Bahamas, the industry was ranked #1 in the country, as I said, and it consisted of 265 schooners, 322 sloops, and almost 3,000 open boats. Now, sponging employed roughly 6,000 men and boys, which is about 1/3 of the available working force at the time. Now, women also worked in the sponging industry, but primarily as sponge trimmers during the processing stage. And I haven't found out very much about women in this industry, but I'm really interested in their role in sponging. So if anyone knows about any records or knows any relatives that had people in the past that were women that were involved in this industry, I'd be really excited to talk to you. And you can find my email address at the end of this slide, at the end of this presentation on one of the slides. So please get in contact with me. Now, by the 1970s, the Bahamas accounted for 30% of all sponges harvested globally, while in 1935, which is not even at the peak of the fishery anymore, the Bahamas was ranked 3rd in the world for sponge exports, which if you think about it, is an incredible feat for such a small country that we were ranked 3rd in the world for a resource, a natural resource. Now, as you will soon see in my reconstruction, the sponging industry in the Bahamas collapsed in the mid-1920s due to a variety of factors. However, as many of you may be aware, there's been a recent push to revive the sponge fishery in the Bahamas with the formation of the Bahamas Commercial Sponging Association and a $1.1 million investment in the industry by the Inter-American Development Bank. Now, our study has 4 primary objectives. The first is to reconstruct sponge exports by species and value. And then we want to identify major drivers of change and stability in this fishery and use that to create a predictive model for sponge landings. And finally, we want to identify sponge population recovery levels needed for a sustainable fishery. Now, focusing on our first objective, we intend to reconstruct the sponge exports for the Bahamas using a method that was developed by Dr. Daniel Pauly and Dr. Dirk Zella to reconstruct fisheries catches all over the world. Now, in a nutshell, this process involves identifying existing catch time series data, determining which time periods of species are missing, and searching for alternative information sources for these missing components, and then developing what we call data anchor points, and then interpolating time periods between these data anchor points, and then lastly, expressing some level of uncertainty in our reconstruction. Now, here's a sponge landings time series for Florida. And you can see here that the sponges are actually separated by different species. And in our reconstruction, we intend to also separate sponges by species, although we'll also present all sponges together and then separated by species. And you'll see why in a second, why that's important. Like for instance, if we look at this graph here, the wool sponge and the yellow sponge suffered dramatic declines in 1939, which is basically following the outbreak of a fungal disease that actually started in the Bahamas and then spread to Florida and Cuba. And so you can see these huge drops in wool sponge and yellow sponge export rates. However, if you look at the grass sponge, it seemed to be virtually unaffected by the fungal disease that hit in 1939. So this is why we really want to be able to break our reconstruction down by species so we can see the different trajectories of these species over time. Now here's a very preliminary look at our sponge export reconstruction thus far, as we're still in the process of collecting and analyzing data. Now the points connected by solid lines are actual data points, while the dashed line shows where we've linearly interpolated between data anchor points. As you can see, current levels of sponge exports are just a drop in the bucket to what they used to be back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. What is also notable is this drastic decline in sponge exports that occurred in the 1920s. Now, many people largely attribute the decline in the sponging industry in the Bahamas to an outbreak of a fungal disease, which killed 70 to 95% of sponges in different areas of the Bahamas. However, as you can see, the sponge industry had actually crashed prior to the disease outbreak, likely due to overharvesting and hurricane damages. And I'll talk more about these factors throughout my talk. But if you notice where we have the line for the disease outbreak, which is 1938 in the Bahamas, those dots are actual data points, so that it's not zero, but the exports are very, very low prior to the outbreak of this disease. And that's because there was a series of hurricanes that actually occurred in the Bahamas in the late 1920s and mid 1930s, as well as due to overfishing. I found records dating it back as like the late 1800s in like the British colonial reports for the Bahamas, talking about concerns about overfishing of sponges. Now, specifically, by searching historical data, we aim to identify major drivers of change and stability in the sponge exports, and we intend to map these factors onto the reconstructed export data. Now, we aim to use about 75% of our reconstructed time series to build a predictive model for sponge landings, and then we'll use the remaining 25% to estimate or to test how good our model performs. Now, some of the factors that we will test as having major impacts on the sponging industry that we'll include in our modeling are hurricanes, diseases, overexploitation, changing international market demands, and changing legislation. Like, as I've said before, hurricanes are a really big one because there were several Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes that occurred in the Bahamas in the late 1800s and early to mid 1900s. So everyone remembers Hurricane Dorian, which was a Category 5 hurricane that hit, I think that was maybe last year or 2 years ago from now. And people were shocked by the damage. Well, actually, that was not the first time that the Bahamas experienced a Category 5 hurricane. This happened several times in the past, and they had major effects on the sponge industry. And as I said before, we had the outbreak of the fungal disease, which actually happened twice throughout the history of the sponging industry, once in the late 1930s and then again in the late 1940s. I talked a bit about overexploitation. And in terms of changing international market demands, the demand for natural sponges kind of declined over time with the introduction of the synthetic sponge. So we kind of will look at this changes in demand for that as well. And then lastly, we're going to look at changing legislation, because after that big outbreak of the fungal disease in the late 1930s, there was legislation introduced to basically to have minimum size limits on sponges that could be captured. There was also a moratorium that was put in place so that you couldn't fish for sponges, because they were hoping to bring back the velvet sponge, but unfortunately those efforts did not work and the sponge still never recovered. But anyway, several documents that I've read thus far highlight the substantial role of hurricanes played in sponge exports. As storms not only damage the sponge beds, but they also damage sponge vessels and warehouses. And I've actually come across fantastic records of the names of sponge vessels, the captain of the boat, as well as the sponge fishermen that all died in major hurricanes while they were actually out on the water sponging. And this is not like one account, this is several vessels of several periods of times where unfortunately lots of sponge fishers lost their lives during hurricanes. Now, to show just how important hurricanes are to the sponge industry in terms of their impacts, here is a time series of sponge exports based on FAO data, just for the recent period, because FAO just starts at about 1981 or so. And you can see at 1992, there's this dip, this substantial dip in sponge exports. And that's actually during the time when Hurricane Andrew hit the Bahamas. And Hurricane Andrew was a Category 4 hurricane. And for those of you who lived through Hurricane Andrew, I know I was in primary school at the time when Hurricane Andrew passed over the Bahamas. It had huge effects, damaged lots of homes and buildings and businesses and infrastructure like docks and so forth. And so this signature of Hurricane Andrew is shown in the sponge exports for the Bahamas, but it's also shown overall in all fisheries for the Bahamas as well. So we're really confident that we're going to see a signal of hurricanes on our sponge reconstruction through time. Now, the last objective, I want to touch on it very briefly, and this is to identify population recovery levels needed for a sustainable fishery. I won't speak too much about this today because I'm still learning about this method, but suffice to say that there's this new method that I found that allows you to estimate maximum sustainable yield from catch time series data. So this figure here is a rough first pass at what maximum sustainable yields would be for the Bahamas, as shown by the gray bands on the graph, if we were to allow sponge populations to recover to historical levels. And as you can see, in theory, we can catch a whole lot, like orders of magnitude more sponges than we are now if we were to allow the fishery to recover. Now with that, I'd like to end by highlighting why this work is important. And first, understanding past patterns and major drivers of sponge exports allows us to better predict future sponge exports and the factors that shape them. Secondly, our study also provides a more accurate baseline of the sponge exports through time, which can be used to inform both current and future management decisions. And lastly, our study will allow us to determine levels of sponge population recovery needed to have a sustainable fishery where we can actually have a pretty big yield. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions at the end of this session.
Thank you. And we will invite our final speaker for today, Morgan Haichu from Nova Southeastern University. And we just want to remind you guys to provide your questions in the Q&A section so that we can answer them at the end of the final speaker.
Okay, can you see my presentation all right?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Bachancia, and thank you very much to the Bahamas Natural History Conference organizers for inviting me to speak this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to everybody who's tuning in online. So my name is Morgan Haichu. I'm a research associate at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the work that we've been doing in Great Stirrup Cay for the past couple of years, focusing on coral restoration and monitoring. And so before I move forward, I do want to acknowledge my co-worker and co-author on this presentation, Cassie Van Wynen, who's been a critical help in all aspects of this project and the research involved. So just to get started, a quick background here. As I'm sure many of you know, coral reefs are some of the most diverse marine ecosystems on the planet. But outside of that diversity, they also provide a variety of ecosystem goods and services, including such things as coastline protection, supporting local and commercial fisheries, as well as tourism-driven economies. And so the Bahamas is a perfect example of those things. Now, unfortunately, a combination of increasing natural and anthropogenic stressors has led to significant declines in coral reefs around the world. And of these stressors, bleaching due to increased sea surface temperatures is one of the biggest threats to coral survival. Now, looking specifically at Bahamian coral reefs, there was a study published in 2016 by Dahlgren et al., and it sounds like an updated version of this should be coming out sometime very soon. But the 2016 study surveyed over 200 reefs from 2011 to 2013. And while there was some variability within the reefs that were surveyed, reefs in the region were generally classified as impaired. And this was on a scale of going from poor to good. And so this study measured things such as coral cover, coral condition, including disease and bleaching, coral size, density, as well as percent mortality. Now, of particular, and I would say extreme importance in the Bahamas and the Caribbean region in general are the acroporid corals. And so this includes staghorn, which is Acropora cervicornis, elkhorn, Acropora palmata, and then the more recent, the hybrid between those two, Acropora prolifera. And so these species of coral, and the perennial species in particular, have historically been significant contributors to shallow reef production for the past approximately 500,000 years. And so their three-dimensional structure and dense thickets, which you can see represented in those photos there, they provide vital habitat for a variety of marine organisms, as well as critical reef structure for coastline protection. Now, unfortunately, these corals have experienced population declines of 80 to 98% since the 1980s due to a combination of those global and local stressors. And that led to them being listed and still currently listed as threatened under the U.S. Endangered Species Act and critically endangered under the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Now, it's because of that decline in these Acropora populations, which led to the relatively recent development of Acropora restoration projects throughout the Caribbean region. And so there's been quite a few projects that have popped up recently, and the goal of these programs is really to maintain genetic diversity through the establishment of in-water or land-based nurseries, and then eventually transplant the nursery-grown corals to the natural reef so that recovery can occur through sexual reproduction. And so that kind of leads us into our goals at Great Stirrup Cay. So this project began in 2018 and is a partnership between Nova Southeastern University, Norwegian Cruise Line, and the Perry Institute of Marine Science. So Great Stirrup Cay is a small island owned by Norwegian Cruise Line, and it's at the northern end of the Berry Island chain, very close to Great Harbor Cay and next door neighbors with Royal Caribbean's Coco Cay. So we have a variety of things that we're trying to accomplish with this project, and I'll kind of run through those quickly here. First of all, our primary objective was to establish and develop, Acropora coral nurseries at the island. And along with that, we were interested in conducting some Acropora restoration research related to growth and survival of nursery fragments. And then tied in with that restoration work, we'd like to outplant our nursery-grown fragments to those local reefs. And as part of all that, we'll be monitoring those outplants, but also we'd like to identify and monitor any of the wild Acropora colonies that are occurring locally around the island. And then we're also interested in establishing kind of a baseline understanding of the conditions of the reefs in that area. And so we've started conducting annual abundance, diversity, and health assessments on the adult stony coral and octocoral populations, as well as investigating the juvenile coral recruitment on those reefs. Now, for the sake of today's talk, I'm really only going to be focusing on the nursery aspect of things, just because we have a lot of information and a lot of data that I could probably spend another 45 minutes just chatting about. So just for today, we'll be talking about the nursery stuff. But just as a quick overview, just to give you an idea of the different research sites that we have around the island, this is just a zoomed in view of Great Stirrup Cay. You can see our nursery is the red dot there on the north side of the island, and then just south of that is our outplant site. And then we have various, you'll see various yellow and orange dots around the island, and so those are identifying the wild elkhorn and staghorn locations that we've managed to find. And then finally, our monitoring and recruitment sites are on the top there in green, those green dots. So our first objective was to establish an Acropora nursery, which we have managed to successfully do. And so we're currently maintaining all three of those Caribbean Acropora, Cervicornis, Palmata, and the hybrid Prolifera. And so these corals were collected from a variety of locations throughout the Bahamas, including locally at Great Stirrup Cay, throughout the Berry Islands, and then from the Nassau, New Providence area. And as I mentioned, we had a research interest tied in with this work. And so we're really interested in investigating the influence of taxa, so Cervicornis, Palmata, and Prolifera, fragment type, genotype, and site, and its impact on growth and survival of these fragments. And so we're taking somewhat of a novel approach here by including the hybrid in this work. Generally, the hybrid isn't used in restoration work, and so we're really interested to see what sort of applications there may be available by including this hybrid, just because it is relatively unknown how it performs in a nursery setting. So to do that, as I mentioned, we collected from corals all over the place, but for this project specifically, we collected from colonies in the Nassau area. And so these fragments were then sectioned into three types that you can see. They were designated as basal, middle, and apical in the figure just above there. And that's based on the orientation to the main colony. And then these fragments were attached to replicate nursery trees at different nursery sites around Great Stirrup Cay. And on a monthly basis for about 13 months, we would measure total linear extension, which is just a measurement of growth of the tissue, percent mortality, and condition data for each one of those fragments. And here just gives you an idea of the location of those replicate nursery sites. So we had 3 around the island in different types of environments. So one in a reef slope area, one in seagrass, and then one more kind of in a lagoonal sand flat. And depth was consistent at all 3 of these nurseries, approximately 3 meters, so 10 to 12 feet. So jumping quickly into the results here, this is a survival analysis based on site. And so I mentioned we were looking at a few different factors there, site being one of them, as well as genotype, taxa, but we found that site was the only significant factor to affect survival. And so what you're seeing here in this survival analysis, we have time on the x-axis and then probability of survival on the y-axis. And just to orient you, basically one is 100% survival. So what we're seeing here is that site N3 shows the significantly greatest survival compared to sites N2 and N1. N1 actually ended up bleaching by the end of the experimental period, so we lost a significant number of fragments there. So you see that there is quite a difference in performance between those sites. And now moving on to growth. So this is a box and whisker plot showing total change in total linear extension for all 3 taxa. And so along the bottom there, we have our 2 parental species. So we have our taxa, Acropora cervicornis, palmata, and then Prolifera. And then on the y-axis is our total linear extension. And then within each one of these, they're broken down by the different fragment types, apical, middle, and basal. So really kind of the big takeaway here that we're seeing is that hybrid fragments had significantly greater growth compared to the parental species during this experimental period. And then looking more specifically at the response within Prolifera, we saw that the combination of apical hybrid fragments, so that would be the gray box and whisker plot that you see there, had the greatest overall growth. And so that was interesting. And then in here, this is kind of another way to really help visualize that. So this is a photo time series of those different taxa. And I kind of want to highlight, or at least draw your attention to the 13-month period. So we can see that there is growth among all of those fragments, but if we look specifically at Acropora prolifera, the hybrid at the bottom, we see that there is a large amount of growth occurring there, lots of tissue that's been added in that 13-month period, and this likely explains the reason behind why we saw such a significantly high growth compared to those parental species. So, our first, big takeaway from this is that site selection is obviously critical to nursery performance. There are obviously some differences in the biotic and abiotic factors occurring at those different sites, likely due to nutrient content and water flow. As I mentioned, that we had some bleaching at some of the sites, and some of the sites were more turbid than others. So, when thinking about restoration, it's really critical to think about where you're putting your sites and the impacts that the local environment has on those sites. But more interestingly, we saw that the hybrid showed greater growth than those parental species in a nursery setting. And this is likely due to that intermediate morphology that the hybrid has. It has this profuse branching growth strategy that creates a lot of tissue in a really rapid, short amount of time. And this has some possible applications for the restoration, Acropora restoration field in general. So there may be some benefits to incorporating the hybrid. So first of all, we saw that rapid growth, and so that would potentially lead to increased novel structure And that's both in the nursery setting and potentially in an outplant setting where corals have been outplanted and you get a lot of growth really quickly on the reef. So there may be some benefits there. And some research has also shown that hybrids may be better able to survive the impacts of climate change, at least future climate change. And so these corals, the hybrids in particular, they occupy a very niche environment. So they're usually found in really shallow reef environments, which is subject to high temperature and high light. But even with the impacts of those stressors, they don't show a higher prevalence of bleaching or disease compared to the parental species. So that's really a good sign. And there also could be some potential genetic benefits with using the hybrid. And this is due to the possibility of novel gene flow via back crossing. And so back crossing means that the hybrid is reproducing with the parental species, and this is known to occur within Acropora. And so this could act as a mechanism for unique gene flow across species boundaries, basically providing a way for novel adaptive genes and genetic variation to be transferred between parental species Acropora cervicornis and Acropora palmata. So another interesting possibility there. And so I'd like to make a quick plug for a publication that is in the works right now on this research, which should hopefully be out by the end of this year, if not early next year, which will really talk about this in more detail. There's a lot of information that went into this. I'm kind of really showing you just a very, very small sample of it. So if you really are curious about learning more, obviously ask me questions, and then this publication will be coming out hopefully soon. So things to consider for the future. Obviously, this was one study in one location, so we really want to do a better job at developing our understanding of how the hybrid performs in all aspects of Acropora restoration. So that includes not only the nursery, but in an outplant setting as well. And then, how they respond to other stressors such as storms. We've talked about storms a bit here, and as well as, the many other stressors that were mentioned before. And, because this is really one piece in the puzzle in understanding, the role the hybrid may play. But I do want to kind of, mention that as a caution, just because we really are limited on our understanding here. And so we really need to explore further what the possibilities of using the hybrid may be. And, again, this is one piece in the puzzle overall of our work at Great Stirrup Cay. As you saw, we have quite a few different things going on there. And it's, it's really contributing to that and dictating how we focus our restoration efforts out there. And then finally, my final thought here is that, restoration has really impactful on a local level, but unfortunately isn't a magic bullet. So if we want to see, the reefs in the Caribbean and globally, be able to kind of recover, at least respond to climate change, we really need to address the major impacts of global climate change. And so that should be our priority. So with that, I'd like to thank our major professors involved with this research, Dr. David Gilliam, Dr. Nicole Fogarty, and Dr. Elizabeth Gergen, as well as a big thanks to our funding sources, Norwegian Cruise Line and the Florida chapter of the Explorers Club, as well as our partners, Dr. Craig Dahlgren and some of the staff at the Perry Institute of Marine Science, as well as Morgan McCall and different members of the NCL team who are working in Miami, as well as at Great Stirrup Cay, who've been a big help. And then all of the people that have helped with data collection and statistical analysis here in the lab. All of that is much appreciated. And so with that, I'm all set. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Morgan. Okay, so that's the final panelist for today, our sixth session. We hope that you can join us for the remaining sessions scheduled to continue every Wednesday into August. As always, we welcome your questions, feedback, and support as the BNT team continues to pivot our programming towards new normal methodologies, including changing the platform of our conference to virtual reality. There is still a need for funding events like these weekly sessions. We would be grateful if you considered donating towards the success of BNHC 2020. If you are enjoying the BNHC Virtual Webinar Series, we simply ask that you consider giving a donation in any amount as a means of showing your support. An email with a donation link will be sent following the sessions. With that said, please submit any questions that you may have for our 4 panelists today. And I think we have a question. I think this question is for Dr. Nicholas Higgs, I believe. And it is, do we think the export of saltwater fish, as we have mostly in the Bahamas, can serve as a lucrative industry?
Hello, I would say, I guess I'm assuming here this is talking about fish product rather than live fish. That's a good question. I'm really just talking anecdotally here. I think we actually can utilize most of the fish that's safe to produce here within the country. Of course, export does happen. But one thing I've noticed anecdotally is a shift from scalefish, reef fish to more pelagic fish to meet the needs of the seafood demand here in local communities. So I really am not sure. I don't think so. I don't think there's a major export industry. Now, that's not to say that, you know, scalefish fishing is not sustainable, but I think to the levels that it would be a high value export fishery, say that rivals the crawfish fishery, I don't think it'll ever get to that level.
Okay, thank you for your response. And we have some questions for Morgan Haichu. And the questions are there other nurseries with a Eleuthera established? And are you planning to work with coral spawning?
All right, yeah, good questions. So off the top of my head, I'm not familiar with other nurseries that are working with the Acropora prolifera, although I have worked with some researchers who do have it within their kind of research sites as part of a research project. But major nurseries, I can't say that I know of any, but there are some kind of like small research-based stuff that are using it. At least I know for sure in Belize, both at Caribou Key, and then also Fragments of Hope would be one that is definitely using it in their nursery. They not only in their nursery, but they've managed to really do a really great successful job at outplanting all 3 of the Caribbean acroporids and having just really great growth and cover over time. So it is being used, but it's on an extremely limited basis, and a lot of that has to do with just kind of a lot of the unknowns that are surrounding the hybrid itself, and some of the limitations that there may be due to sexual reproduction. So yeah, very, very good question. And then the other question, planning to work with spawning. Yeah, so I'd hoped to, and we did last year, but it's going to be unlikely that we'll be able to do any spawning work, at least in the Bahamas at this point. But last year we were able to monitor spawning at Great Stirrup Key, at least for a certain period of time. While we didn't actually see spawning, we were able to confirm that some of those colonies, those wild colonies that we see around Great Stirrup Key are reproductively active. Yeah.
Thank you. And then we have a comment for Dr. Higgs. It would be awesome if you could post some of these slides as standalone graphics that could be shared on Instagram or Facebook. The conch size image was great and put things into perspective. Also emphasizes the needs that exist in our communities and also speaks to the challenges of managing our fisheries. That was a comment made on Facebook for Dr. Higgs.
Yeah, for sure. I'll try and get some of this stuff available. Obviously, everything is preliminary at this phase, and actually looking to add in a little bit more data. But in terms of preliminary images and anything presented today, I'm happy for that to be shared freely. And I'll try and get that up probably via Figshare, and then it could be distributed over social media. No problem with that. I think the more we can get this information out there, the better.
Okay, thank you. And to Dr. Smith, how many people are currently employed in the sponge fishing industry in the Bahamas, and how many does the current dollar value of this industry compare with that in past, such as its peak? Is the volume of current sponge fishing sustainable, or is this as yet unknown?
Wow, those are really great questions. And in terms of the number of people currently employed in the sponging industry, I don't have an idea of what those numbers are like as yet, but I am going to definitely get that information as the study continues. I'm thinking that a place to start would probably be the Bahamas Commercial Sponge Association. As if you're a member of the association, I'm sure they're tracking how many people are involved in the fishing industry for sponges. And in terms of the dollar value, I think the fishery is just starting up again at any sort of notable level on the export market, particularly because the international demand for natural sponges has suddenly peaked again. So I don't know what the exact numbers. Actually, I do. I do know the dollar values of the industry right now, but I don't have that information off the top of my head. So you'll have to email me that question and I can get back to you on that.
Okay.
And then the last thing about is the current sponge fishing sustainable right now. Yes, so currently that's unknown, because to know if it's sustainable, we kind of have to know what's the population abundance out there and what level we're actually fishing at. And I don't think that information is currently available.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Smith. I think that wraps up our question and answering session. This session is being recorded and is streaming live on Facebook. After today's session, the recording will be available to all by visiting the Bahamas National Trust Facebook page and YouTube channel. If you'd like to keep up or get in touch with BNHC, do so by visiting our website, bnhc242.com, and facebook.com/thebnhc to follow social media updates. Questions and suggestions can be directed by email to bnhc@bnt.bs. Thank you all for attending our 6th session of BNHC Virtual. We hope to see you next week.
Hey, Nick, are you still on?
Hey, yeah.
I'll send you my phone number and you can call me through WhatsApp.
Cool.
Okay, great. Texting now.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Giselle.
Thank you all for facilitating this.